Also, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, es freut mich sehr, dass Sie den Weg hierher gefunden haben heute. Wie wir alle wissen, war das ja auch nicht ganz unkompliziert, hierher zu gelangen. Aber unser Gast ist ja auch nicht irgendjemand. Und somit schätze ich, war es das wert, die Mühen auf sich zu nehmen, um hierher diesen Abend gemeinsam zu begehen. Wer heute auf dem Weg hierher war, kann natürlich auch nicht verpasst haben die Demonstration. Also wie ich unterwegs war, sind wir aus der Straßenbahn ausgestiegen und haben schon mitbekommen, wie die Straßen langsam gesperrt werden, wie die Polizeipräsenz eine immer stärkere wird. Naja, das übliche Bild, das wir alle kennen von Demonstrationen. Und da witzelten wir ein bisschen, wir schmunzelten unterwegs hierher, weil wir gemeint haben, da draußen gibt es eine Demonstration heute, die eigentlich auch so gedeutet werden kann, die kreative Klasse demonstriert gerade gegen eine ziemlich hässliche Manifestation der Krise der Stadt. Und wer sich nicht so gut auskennt mit Richard Florida, könnte sagen, naja, und gleichzeitig, mehr oder weniger mittendrin, in einem Gebäude, das man als Symbol des Kapitalismus ja auch werden könnte, gibt es eine Veranstaltung, in der jemand spricht, der in den Verdacht steht, ein Neoliberaler zu sein. Aber ich glaube, dass man irrt, wenn man das so sieht. Und ich glaube, dass der heutige Abend noch ziemlich spannend werden wird. Da wird es sich um einiges drehen und auf alle Fälle wird es sich drehen eben um die Krise der Stadt und was man dagegen unternehmen kann. Der Abend wird so ablaufen, dass zunächst Richard Florida einen 45-minütigen Vortrag ungefähr halten wird und danach gibt es Zeit für eine Diskussion, die ich mit ihm führen werde hier auf dieser Bühne. Um 8:30 Uhr ist Schluss. Natürlich habe ich einige Fragen, die ich ihm stellen möchte, aber ja, abhängig davon, wie wir mit der Zeit zurande kommen, hoffe ich, dass ich gegen Ende auch die Möglichkeit habe, ein, zwei Fragen aus dem Publikum zu nehmen. Das heißt, man möge sich schon überlegen, was man schon immer Richard Florida fragen wollte. Der Abend wird im Übrigen auf Englisch sein und mehr habe ich an dieser Stelle nicht zu sagen. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks to the City of Vienna, and thanks to the organizers of this Urban Transformation series and all of you for inviting me back to this magnificent city. Talk for a little while and then the Deputy Mayor and I can have a conversation and hopefully talk a bit about your city and the challenges it faces. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about me. And not just my interest in cities, but me, and how I grew and developed, and how my interest in cities really came as a part of my own growth and development, and really is an integral and intrinsic part of me. It's not something I came to just as work or as a vocation. It's a critical part of my growth and development as a human being and a critical part of my life. And many times, you know, when I look back at my life, it seems like the arc of my life really has tracked the arc of cities and urban development. Well, I was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1957. Many of you may know Newark, New Jersey because it's the home of a major airport. It's in the shadow of Lower Manhattan. You may have taken a flight through Newark or visited Newark or spent time on the highway around Newark. But Newark was a thriving and bustling city when I was a little boy. I'm Italian-American. I grew up in the Italian-American section of Newark. Newark was a diverse city. It had an Italian-American district. It had a German-American district. It had an Irish-American, Polish-American, Jewish-American, African-American, Hispanic-American district. It had a large commercial center with department stores and restaurants and shops. It was one of the first in North America manufacturing centers. and had a great manufacturing center called the Ironbound section. It's called the Ironbound section because it was bounded by train tracks with all sorts of shops and factories where my dad worked. Newark, as you may know now, is the most challenged city in the United States. It has the highest rate of poverty, it has the highest rate of infant mortality, it has the horrific rate of violent crime. So as the 1950s turned into 1960s, and as societies became more mobile, as automobiles began to be produced more readily after the war, as manufacturing became a dominant economic paradigm, people began to move from cities like my city of Newark to the outlying suburbs. My parents decided to move to an outlying working class suburb called North Arlington, not far from Newark, a very hard scrabble place. It is actually, my town is featured in the opening scenes of The Sopranos. It's where Tony Soprano drives his car. The Pizza Land, Pizzeria, the Bada Bing Club are parts of my hometown. My town was a very working class place in the truest sense of that term. And as a young boy, I see some of you are my age, many of you are younger, but as a young boy growing up in the United States, in Newark, in the shadow of New York City in the early 1960s, trust me, my first thought was not to be an urbanist. My first thought was actually, because I was very much influenced by the music coming from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and early rock and roll, what I wanted to be was a guitar player. So I made a deal with my dad, and the deal with my dad was that he would buy me an electric guitar, and it's a very expensive thing for a factory worker to buy for his son, if I would agree to two stipulations. The first was that I would go with him to the Newark Public Library, even though we had moved to North Arlington, on the weekend, and get books out of that library so that I could study and learn about things, which my dad knew little about. And the second was that I would learn to play music, that I would not just play rock and roll like Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton or all the people I admired. And he found me a guitar teacher in Newark, New Jersey, where I could take lessons. So scroll forward, this is now the year 1967. Almost this time of year, July. And it's a very hot July, the temperature is over 90 degrees, 30 degrees Celsius, and it's a time of great strife. Newark has seen the outmigration of people, the outmigration of jobs. The city was beginning to see more activism. In fact, I heard there was a demonstration in Vienna today about police brutality. Newark was the center of incredible levels of white police violence against black Americans. There was a budding movement of black Americans, the civil rights movement and others, to stand up for their rights. And one day when we were driving to our guitar lesson, because the media was far less developed, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have social media, we were driving to my guitar lesson, and you could sense something was wrong, but my dad and I didn't know what it was. And my dad was in the driver's seat and I was right next to them. And all of a sudden, my dad, who was a World War II veteran, I wouldn't know, heard gunshots. Gunshots ring out, bang, bang, bang. And he said, "Rich, get down on the floor." And I crouched down on the floor in the passenger seat, the front seat. And as my dad pulled his car over, you could see not only police and police vehicles, but military. These were the so-called National Guard that had been called out to secure Newark from what then became known as the Race Riots of 1967, the hot summer of 1967. The Race Riots, which began in Newark and spread across the United States. And when I looked up and composed myself, I could see these armored vehicles, these police vehicles, and as we drove out of the city, I could see the city's commercial corridors in flames. Now, I don't think any 10-year-old boy makes a decision to become an urbanist on a hot July day, but I think that day really affected me. I think that is in many ways the day that I became, or whatever DNA, so cellular material was inside me, or cognitive, that was the day that something about cities struck me. What was happening in Newark? Why was the city declining? Why was it up in flames? What was this racial tension about? And I think all of that just swirled around in the back of my mind. And I went about my elementary school days, I went about my high school days, and then there came time to go to college and university. I was very lucky. I was smart. I don't know why. I don't know how or why that was. Neither of my parents went to college. My dad didn't go to high school. My dad had to quit school in the 7th grade to go to work to help support his family. But I had an affinity for books. I like to read and I like to write. And I got a scholarship. The New Jersey is known as the Garden State. Don't ask me how. There's something of a contradiction in those two words, New Jersey and Garden State, but that's neither here nor there. I got a scholarship which enabled me to go to any of the state universities in New Jersey. And the best one was called Rutgers College, not far away in New Brunswick, but enabled me to leave a peer group that I would say approaching 15, 16, 17, went from a group of nice, kind of friendly kids to a group of very troubled, Sopranos-like kids who were beginning to get in all sorts of difficulty with the law. Drug abuse, drunken driving, petty drug dealing, petty theft. And for me, getting out of that town and going to university seemed like a way out. My parents didn't want me to go away. I'm Italian. They wanted me to stay home. They wanted me to marry the Italian girl next door. They wanted me to go to local Catholic college, but I didn't want to do that. Something was pushing me to go to this university. Well, I was the oldest kid. First one to go to college. My parents wanted me to study something that would enable me to become, in their eyes, successful. Well, what would Italian immigrant parents want for their son who never went to college? Well, success in their terms was to be a medical doctor. And so they pushed me to take biology and chemistry and pre-medicine, and I got terrible grades. For the first time in my life, I got terrible grades. And I remember I went home for the holiday when the semester was over, and I told my parents I wanted to change my major. And my parents besieged me. They actually called a meeting of my 7 sets of aunts and uncles, 14 aunts and uncles, actually 28 aunts and uncles, and about 50 cousins to convince me to buck up and to study medicine. And I had a thing, I remember my mom saying, there was another profession that was very good. I said, you know, like Mom said, maybe I could be a lawyer. And they agreed, you could take pre-law. So the next semester, this is 1975, I took a course in political science, a course in economics, a course in sociology, and I saw in the course catalog there was a course in urban geography. And I signed up for it. And the professor gave us an assignment, and the assignment was to take the Amtrak train from New Brunswick, New Jersey into Lower Manhattan, Penn Station, and to take our notebooks and to write down what we saw. He gave us a little map, go through Chelsea, go through the meatpacking district, walk the west side of Manhattan, go through the Flatiron district, walk down along the West Side Highway, now the Highline Park. It wasn't a Highline Park, it was a dilapidated rail line. The meatpacking district actually had meatpacking factories. Walk down to Greenwich Village, walk down to Soho, walk down to Tribeca, and write down what you saw. I saw something completely different than Newark. I saw a city that was home to bohemians, artists, and the artists were squatting in Soho, in those beautiful areas of Soho, which we now know. The artists were taking over the industrial loss and hooking up plumbing and electricity. There were professors around NYU. There were hippies. I was a hippie then. There was this new group of people called punks, you know, the early punks with mohawk hair. And I couldn't believe it. And that was the day I said, that was the day I got hooked. By random chance, an assignment takes me to the streets of New York, and I just threw myself into the study of this subject, and I think I was trying to make sense of why my city of Newark had declined in industry and jobs, and people had moved away to the suburbs, and this place, literally, 10 minutes away, less than 5 miles, connected by a path train or by two tunnels, Lincoln and particularly the Holland Tunnel, why this place called New York City could be so dynamic and so vibrant, why these kinds of renewal was occurring. Well, anyway, I graduated, I studied political science and urban planning. I went off to Columbia University to take a PhD. I wrote this just horribly turgid thesis. Oh my God, you know, I've always been very influenced by Marx. We'll talk about that maybe. And I wrote this kind of neo-Marxist analysis of housing and the urban crisis. And I remember showing it to my mom, a very simple woman, Italian-American woman. And my mom was a pretty good reader and speller. Her job, my dad worked in the factory, her job was an ad taker. She worked in the local paper taking ads, like if you wanted to sell something or sell a car or rent an apartment. And she just looked at this thing and she said, what are you trying to say? And she literally threw the manuscript on the floor. She just started laughing, like, who are you trying to write this where I can't make heads or tail of it? So anyway, I took the PhD at Columbia. I went off and became a professor. I began to study the evolution of contemporary capitalism. That was my real interest. I went off to study at Ohio State, to be a professor at Ohio State. And I got involved in two projects, which would both lead me ultimately to write Rise of the Creative Class. But this is in the 1980s. In the 1980s, as you may know, capitalism was starting to experience crisis in a very serious way. The old post-war model of Fordist mass production and mass suburbanization, mass production and mass consumption, and the social contract in which it was based, labor parties, modern social democracy, was starting to fracture our societies. There was a famous book written in the United States by two of my professors, Bennett Harrington and Barry Bluestein. People became great friends, called The Deindustrialization of America. That deindustrialization swept through these parts of Europe. The cracks were becoming very apparent in the old post-war Fordist model of scientific management, industrial assembly line, big factories. And people at that time were trying to figure out what would come next. What would be a post-industrial or post-Fordist kind of economy? And with a guy named Martin Kenney, who's still a dear friend, we began to look at two things. We began to look at the high-tech areas of the Silicon Valley in Northern California and the area around Boston and Harvard and MIT and Cambridge and the Route 128 suburbs as maybe a new way of organizing capitalism. And what was really fascinating, even though American firms were deindustrializing the heartland, the Rust Belt, right next to Ohio State University, Honda opened a brand new manufacturing facility, a automobile manufacturing plant in Marysville. And we began to study the new ways of manufacturing being pioneered by the Japanese and others. We were trying to make sense of what kind of economic system would come after Fordism. What kind of system might be a post-industrial, post-Fordist way of organizing the economy? And all of this is swirling about, and the 1980s are proceeding. And I'm offered a job to go to Carnegie Mellon University to teach in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, I knew that Carnegie Mellon was a very good university, had a great computer science program, robotics, software engineering, and I sensed that Pittsburgh was the kind of city that was undergoing an urban transformation. Now, when I moved to Pittsburgh in 1987, the city was hit with an economic trauma. And by the way, I just interviewed the mayor of Pittsburgh, an old friend of mine. I just interviewed him last week on stage. And he reiterated what I'm going to tell you because we lived it together. As he reminded me, he was not yet a city councilor, he was a staff member to a city councilor. I thought he was on the council. He said, no. When we met Richard, I was a staff member to a city councilor. Then I became a city councilor, and many years later became the mayor. Pittsburgh lost more than 150,000 jobs in manufacturing industries in just a couple of years. It saw the decimation of its steel industry, but Pittsburgh wasn't just a steel town, it was the home of Westinghouse Electronics, gone. It had a massive chemical and paint industry, Pittsburgh Chemicals and Pittsburgh Paints. High-tech industries are based on railroad switches and signals. I could go on. Rockwell Aerospace was born there. That whole economy was decimated. A city whose population, a city whose population topped out at over 900,000 people, saw that population shrink to 800 to 700 to 600 to 500 to 400, before stopping where that population currently is at about 330,000 people. It lost 2/3 of its people. And the question on the minds of the city leadership, and the reason they wanted me to come, even though I was a young professor of less than 30 years of age, is they wanted to create a new economic development and urban strategy to rebuild Pittsburgh. And I was recruited there to help create an institute, a center for studying these kind of post-industrial economic transformations. And I think we came up with an ingenious strategy. And I think to a large degree it worked. Here was the strategy in a nutshell. And I think you can see all the work that now you would know and associate with my name. I think you'll see how it comes from this. The strategy was that even though Pittsburgh has lost manufacturing, and even though those factories had closed, and even though it had been dealt an economic blow unlike that of almost any other place in the world, it had some assets to build upon. It had several great universities, great research universities, great knowledge institutions. Carnegie Mellon, which I already mentioned, was one of the top 2 or 3 computer departments in the world. Computer science, software engineering, robotics, I could go on. The University of Pittsburgh with a large medical center, expert in transplantation, biomedical research, and others. And the idea was if we could take that university research capability and combine it with the companies. See, even though the companies that lost their factories, all of these great companies still had research and development in the Pittsburgh city or Pittsburgh region. So it not only had academic research, it had industrial research, and the idea was if we could put them together, we could grow ourselves a cluster or concentration of high-tech industries that would look like what was happening in California's Silicon Valley, that would look like what was happening around the Boston, that would look like what was happening in the so-called Research Triangle of North Carolina. We could build our own cluster. We created the world's first technology transfer program at Carnegie Mellon University. We created another one at the University of Pittsburgh. We joined them. We created entrepreneurial assistance organizations. We created the world's first high-technology council. The first one in the world, the Council of High-Tech Industries. We created significant entrepreneurial incubation and acceleration and support vehicles. Our state government created the world's first program to invest in combinations of industrial and university R&D. They call it the Ben Franklin Partnership Program. And all of this began to work. At Carnegie Mellon, we began to develop the top leading not only academic researchers, but industrial researchers of the world. My colleagues were going to lead companies like Apple and Microsoft and later Google. They were leading, not the CEOs, but leading the research units. Our graduate students were going on to propel those companies. And we were beginning to develop a little community of startup companies in our hometown. Well, I'd been a professor at Carnegie Mellon for nearly 10 years, and I got offered the opportunity to go off to Harvard to join the John F. Kennedy School of Government on sabbatical. There I joined not a group of economists and urbanists. I joined a group of Nobel Prize-winning scientists. The person who built the School of Applied Physics and Engineering at Harvard. The former vice president of science at IBM. The former head of NASA, the space agency's research institute. These were all men much older than me, in their 70s at the time. And Nobel Prize winners in physics and chemistry and biology, combined with social scientists and economists and urbanists, all who were looking for ways to chart a path out of deindustrialization, the crisis of manufacturing, the crisis of Fordism, and to build post-industrial strategies for economic revitalization and renewal, just like we had in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a core example. That's why they wanted this youngster, at the time, me, to come to Harvard, to help them distill and understand Pittsburgh as the base case. If you could do it in Pittsburgh, you could do it across Europe. You could do it in other areas of the Rust Belt. You can take the attributes of that model and apply it by combining university and industry research to revitalize older regions. And one day, a nice April day, I was driving my car into my office in Boston, and I saw the rowers rowing on the Charles River. It was a beautiful spring day, the leaves and flowers are blooming. And I grabbed a coffee and went up to my office, and the paper is called the Boston Globe. I offered the paper, the Boston Globe, to a headline that would change my life. You see, we had created a number of companies from Carnegie Mellon University, but one of our companies in particular was quite successful. It was, name doesn't matter, it's no longer with us, but it was one of the first companies to organize information on the internet. It was a competitor at the time with Google, and a competitor with Yahoo. One of the top three. And we had spun that company off from the university. Our professors formed that company. Our graduate students drove and propelled that company. We created new management for the company. We'd actually got in a lovely new building right outside of our campus. It was part of the DNA of Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and the headline read that that company was going to move to Boston. I couldn't believe what my eyes had seen. The company was born and bred in Pittsburgh. It came from our research. It was the fruit of our efforts. All the things that we had accomplished were tied up in that company, and now it was leaving Pittsburgh to move to Boston. And I needed to know why. I called my colleagues back at the university. I called the people I knew at the company. I put my best students on the case. And the answer that came back shocked me because it confounded everything I thought I knew. What I thought I knew, what I had written about, what my professors had told me, what my field had said, is that if you wanted to grow an economy, what you have to do is create companies that create good jobs. That's why we built those university industry partnerships. That's why we wanted to build that cluster. If we could create the companies that had the good jobs that people would come to. The dirty little secret of my field, and as it was happening in Pittsburgh, is that they were using tax incentives, bribes. They were bribing companies, and still are with the Amazon HQ2, bribing companies using tax incentives to try to get them to come. That's how much they said they meant. Pittsburgh had spent more than $2 billion building a new airport, building a new convention center, building 2 new baseball stadiums, a baseball and a football stadium. But none of this had to do why this company was leaving Pittsburgh to go to Boston. Boston didn't offer any tax incentives. I could go on. Its airport was old. Its baseball stadium was the oldest in North America. The football stadium was somewhere where the New England Patriots play. That's not in Boston. It's somewhere far off field. But hold on. They offered no tax incentives, no financial incentives. Labor costs were more in Boston. Wages were more in Boston. Housing was more in Boston. Taxes are higher in Boston. In the United States, they sometimes, when they want to make fun of more liberal jurisdictions, they call Massachusetts Taxachusetts. It's a silly American joke. Or maybe a sick American joke. But the point of the matter is, all the costs were higher in Boston than Pittsburgh, and there were no incentives. And then they told me the reason. The company was moving from Pittsburgh to Boston for one reason and one reason only: to get access to a group of talented, knowledgeable, innovative, and dare I say creative people that were already living in Boston. In the eyes of the company, it was taking too long to recruit them to come to Pittsburgh. And I couldn't get this out of my head. This was an April day. I've got May and June in the summer to think about it. And it's just there, and it won't go away. It won't go away when I try to think about something else. It won't go away when I try to do research. It won't go away when I try to go to the beach or go for a bike ride. It's just there. Why? How? How could this be happening? And I went back to Carnegie Mellon University in the fall, and I had a group of students, not smaller than this, say it's 30, 35 students. Graduate students from public policy and business and engineering and all these different fields. And I asked them, I said, I didn't say what's going on in Pittsburgh. I framed a question in my head, off the top of my head. I said, when you graduate, how many of you will stay in Pittsburgh? One hand went up. I said, where will you go? I'll go to Boston, I'll go to New York, I'll go to San Francisco, I'll go to Seattle, I'll go to Austin, blah, 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 blah. I said, but why? They said, because these places have energy. And I'm thinking, they can't be talking about low electricity and gas prices, right? They're talking about something else. And I began, well, what is energy? Well, energy is excitement. It comes from people. It comes from all these things are flooding into my mind. And I remember it hit me after about 6 months of thought. It wasn't jobs that were the driving factor in urban and city development. The people weren't going to the jobs. That's the Pittsburgh paradox. We had the good jobs. We had the high-paying jobs. We had the tech jobs, and my students didn't want them. Instead of the people going to the jobs were picking themselves up and moving from Pittsburgh to Boston where the people are. And I said, that's what I've got to study. Because no one else even considered it. It was the location choices not of companies, but of people. It was the location choices of people that mattered and that were shaping our economy, this post-industrial, post-war economy, in ways no one anticipated. So then I embarked on, you can time it, from the late 90s to now, this several decades research project that led to several books that some of you may know, to try to distill, and trust me, I know how boring my books can be. Maria has one. They're filled with like pages and pages of statistics and appendices, and I promise if you buy one or have one, it'll be the best month of sleeping you'll ever have. So I just want to summarize the key big takeaways of that couple-decade process of work. Well, the first thing we figured out, and it led to a lot of contestation, a lot of debate, and a lot of controversy, is that people, talented and knowledgeable and innovative and creative people, are the stuff that powers this new economy. Now trust me, when I said that to myself back in 1999, even I thought I was insane. My publisher, who accepted to publish what would become Rise of the Creative Class, I didn't title it Rise of the Creative Class, I had all these awful titles. He had to sit me down in New York City many times and push and push and push and push, and he said, Richard, you are describing something like a new class of people. I'm like, yeah, I'm no new incarnation of Karl Marx, brother. Like, I really am not that. I'm not going there. So I remember one day I went back, and I had one student collect historical time series data. It wasn't even on a census tape. You had to go to the library and look at all the censuses of the United States going back to the founding of the country. And I had another student who was a computer scientist, and this couldn't be done on a desktop. It had to be done on a big supercomputer at Carnegie Mellon. Look at all the city data for the United States, and look at this new group of people. I didn't call them the creative class. I didn't have a word for them, but I said, well, it's scientists and technologists, other people who talk about knowledge workers, like Peter Drucker, Viennese. Knowledge workers and professional, all of this, and managers, the technocracy. And I said, let's collect some data. Let me tell you what came back. And how big and rattling this was. In the year 1900 in the United States, because we first did this, and I'm telling you what we did in like 1999. In the year 1900 in the United States, more than half the population worked on a farm. The same was for sure true here in Vienna, in Austria. About a growing share were beginning to work in factories. The Industrial Revolution was moving apace, but still a majority of people worked on the farm. Less than 5% of Americans were members, and I will be sure it's less than 5% of Austrians and Viennese, were members of what I call the creative class. Scientists, technologists, knowledge workers, people who work in management, professions, law and healthcare. By the year 1950, our economy had dramatically changed. By the year 1950, 50% of Americans worked in factories. Less than 10% of Americans were members of the creative class. Between 1980 and today is when this new economy, this knowledge economy that Peter Drucker called, the creative economy that I call it, forms fully into motion. 20 to 30 million new jobs created just in the United States, a third of the workforce, 50 million workers. In the leading countries of the world, Singapore, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, 45 or 50% of the workforce are now members of the creative class. In Austria, it's about 36%, much greater than the United States and a third, and about the same as Canada. And this is why I say we have lived through the greatest economic transformation in human history. Now you think, well, it was a big transformation when we moved from agrarian to an industrial society, the kind of things Marx wrote about. And that was a very painful transition. The rise of the ills, socialism, communism, fascism, massive depressions, world wars, but throughout all of history before us, we created wealth by combining raw materials and physical labor. For the first time in human history, we are no longer subject to these physical constraints. The mind has become the means of production. And by the way, Marx anticipated this in the Grundrisse. He anticipated this 150 years ago, where he wrote, "Nature builds no locomotives, no self-acting mules. Those are products of the human mind, of social, intellectual labor objectified." Now our economy has become what he anticipated more than 150 years ago. Our economy is driven by knowledge, by information, by technology, by human intellect. The mind has become the means of production by creativity. Why do I say it's creativity? For a very simple reason, and I go back to Marx. Marx said it was not just that physical labor drove the economy forward and workers weren't compensated for it. Marx said it was our human physical labor that made us part of the universal class. We were all members of the working class because we shared our physical labor in the productions of goods and services. It's not physical labor that makes us different from other species, from animal life. The thing that makes us different from animal life, a mule can pull something. A donkey can provide work. Dogs can help us in fields. The thing that differentiates us from all other species is the fact that we are all creative. Every single human being is creative. It is the quintessential social unit of production. I see it in my two little girls every day as they grow and develop. You see it in any little boy or girl. We share creativity. Our creativity is something we hand down and act upon. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Creativity is a social process. It doesn't come from individuals. It comes from us working together and sharing it through time and across one another. I didn't learn this from reading textbooks. I learned this from my father. My father worked in a factory in the ironbound section in Newark called Victory Optical, making eyeglasses just like these. And on Saturdays when the factory was working overtime, my dad had to work before taking me to the library or a guitar lesson. He'd take me to the factory. And my dad would see me focused on the machines, extruding the plastic frames or plating the metal frames. Those machines came from Germany. Those machines came from Austria. Those machines came from Italy. My dad said, these machines aren't what make the factory great, Rich. They're old machines from Europe. What makes the factory great is the knowledge, the intelligence, and the creativity of the men and women who work here. These simple people like me, Italian Americans, German Americans, Hispanic Americans, Latin Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, African Americans. It is the knowledge and creativity of these people that keep the factory going. Now, I've since heard that from great CEOs and business builders, but I heard it from my dad. Creativity is the economic force of production. Creativity drives our economy forward. It's not the knowledge or information or technology we produce. It's not the things that are poured into our heads in school. It's our intrinsic, ineluctable human creativity which drives the economy. And it defies the social categories of race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and nationality we have imposed on ourselves. Creativity requires diversity. When I wrote about this, it caused a scandal. I was called a heretic. When we invented our measures of a Bohemian index, correlating a city's economic success to its share of creative artists and musicians and designers. When, with colleagues, I looked at the share of gay and lesbian people and the innovativeness in economic development, people said, does he really believe that cities can be built by yuppies, sophistos, trendoids, and gays? Is he gay? Is he trying to foist his gay agenda on us? He's hidden it all along? Is he trying to undermine, they literally wrote this, Professor Florida's endgame is to undermine Judeo-Christian civilization as we currently know it. I had none of that in mind. I was simply trying to look at the factors that drive economic and urban development in a post-industrial economy. And that factor is us. And it flourishes in the places that are most open to the greatest diversity of people. And our proxy measures of artists and bohemians and gays were picking that up. So it wasn't surprising to me that the places like San Francisco or Seattle or Boston or New York that have the highest concentrations of gays and bohemians in the United States also had the DNA that it could attract the weird, the strange, the different, the entrepreneurial. Well, and that led me to a second major conclusion. If creativity was the motor force of our new economy, and creativity comes from us, and each and every one of us is creative, the new container of this economy isn't my father's factory. It isn't an industrial economy driven by factories and factory production, by the Pittsburghs and Detroits and the great industrial cities of Europe. No, 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 no. The new container, the new organizing unit of this people and creative-driven economy was the city itself. The human beings, the mind had become the means of production, and the city had become the organizing unit of the mode of production. And when I was able to meet Jane Jacobs, the greatest urbanist of all time, when I moved to Toronto, she was in her 80s, I said to Jane, what do you think is the greatest contribution you've made to our thinking? And she said, Richard, I humbly submit, I think I figured out something that has puzzled all of the other economists who've worked with this. She said, most economists believe that what drives the economy forward are factories. That factories and industries are what propel the economy. If we have big, giant factories with R&D labs, we'll win. She said, but I think there's something else at work. I think it's the coming together of people in cities. It's the clustering of people in cities. It's the concentration and compacting people of cities. A factory or a company can make something more efficient and make something cheaper. But to quote another great Viennese thinker, Joseph Schumpeter, as people like Joseph Schumpeter have pointed out, what we really need to think about is where new innovations and new ideas and new industries come from. And that, Jane Jacobs said, doesn't come from companies. It comes from clusters of companies, and most importantly, clusters of people who thrive in dense, diverse cities. I just reviewed a study this week in the Atlantic City Lab, where I write. It was by a German economist who wanted to study the clustering of creatives, but not in the modern day economy, in 18th and 19th century England. And what she looked at was the clustering of writers. And what she found is that more than 50% of all writers in England in the 18th and 19th century were clustered in one city, London. And those writers were 10 to 15% more productive in London than anywhere else. And when writers moved from Edinburgh or Glasgow or Manchester to London, those writers became more productive. Writers, artists, techies, scientists. These are non-individual pursuits. What Jane Jacobs said is our productivity multiplies when we compact in a neighborhood or a community or a city. It magnifies the sum of the parts. We become better. That's why artists emerge in scenes. That's why musicians create music scenes. That's why tech companies cluster. We looked at this from the world, satellite images of the world at night. When everyone was talking about globalization and the flying apart and the world is flat, we wanted to look at the real clusters that define our world economy. We found 40 distinct clusters of light images across the world's economy. The New York, Boston, Washington corridor, Greater London, the area from Tokyo. It's not China, it's Shanghai and Beijing. It's not India, it's Bangalore to Mumbai. This area from Vienna to Budapest, Frankfurt to Stuttgart, Greater London, I could go on. These 40 mega regions produce 2/3 of the world's manufacturing products, or economic output. 2/3 of the world's economic output, 9 in 10 of the world's innovations, housing less than 1/5 of our population. The creative economy is not just clustered and concentrated, it's incredibly spiky and unequal. It's not just that we face economic inequality, we face spatial or geographic inequality. If you want to know what's behind the surge of populism across the United States, across Canada, across the world, it's this. I learned this in Canada. When I moved to Toronto, I thought I was moving to the nirvana of progressive urbanism, a place that had a real social compact, publicly financed healthcare, investment in transit and transport, invested in housing. No more than a year that I was there, Toronto elected the crack mayor, Rob Ford. Remember him? Before Donald Trump, before the rise of populists in many other places, Toronto elected the original populist, who came to power by threatening to tear out bike lanes, by challenging the creative class and the urban elite. Because the creative economy, the knowledge economy, and the creative class were concentrating and clustering. That was creating economic advantage. That was creating innovation. That was powering the rise of the knowledge economy. But it was dividing people across 2 dimensions. There were the third of us in the United States, the 35% of us in Canada, the 37% of us in Austria, the 45% of us in Sweden or Denmark or Singapore, the 50+% of us in great cities who were members of the creative class who were doing terrifically. The blue-collar working class had shrunk, and shrunk, and shrunk, so much so that less than a fifth of all workers are members of it anymore. And most of them drive trucks, or do installation work or maintenance work. Only 5% of the workforce in the advanced countries actually work in a factory like my daddy. And there was another great class, the service class, the people who prepare our foods, who take care of our children, who wait on us in retail stores, who deliver goods to our homes, who take care of our offices, provide the support structure of the modern economy. The divide between the creative class and the blue-collar working and service classes was growing and growing and growing. And it was worse, I discovered, in the epicenters of the creative economy. In San Francisco, and New York, and Seattle, and Boston. That divide was the biggest, and when you took the exorbitant price of housing into account, it grew even bigger. And that divide was geographic. These groups were clustered in a few cities, which I call the winner-take-all cities. It's not just that our economy is winner-take-all. Our cities have become winner-take-all, with London, and New York, and Boston, and Seattle, and dare I say Toronto and Vienna. And that's when I wrote my book, The New Urban Crisis. I decided I had to dig into this, as heart-wrenching as it was. You see, I saw the old urban crisis in New York firsthand. I saw the city explode into race riots as a 10-year-old boy. But now, as a person in his 50s approaching 60, what I was seeing all those decades later was an urban rebirth that I could have never anticipated. Not just San Francisco, and New York, and Boston, and Toronto, and Vienna. I saw Pittsburgh come back. Pittsburgh become the center of self-driving cars and robotics and automation and computer, and experience a renaissance. I saw my wife's hometown of Detroit come back, and a downtown that was abandoned brought back to life. Gleaming towns, renovated buildings, new high-tech companies. My own Newark. My own Newark. Seeing a surge of investment from young people and artists priced out of New York City, so much so that when Amazon had its much ballyhooed competition for its second headquarters, which I was very critical of. I was very critical of this extraction of incentives. 236 communities in North America competed for this. 20 were selected as finalists. Among that finalist group was Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, New York City, Boston, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Among the 20 finalists were Pittsburgh and Newark, and Detroit just missed the group. I wanted to try to understand what this new urban crisis, not of dysfunction and failure, it was a new urban crisis of success. The very success of cities in drawing in talent, in drawing in knowledge, in combining the skills of their universities and knowledge bases, in creating this clustering of creatives. And what did we find? The things that I anticipated in the year 2000 while writing Rise of the Creative Class occurred in steroids in the 2 decades since. We, and when I say we, I mean you. We have seen such an accelerated back to the city movement that no one in the world, including all of the experts, could have ever anticipated. That it has occurred with astonishing and mind-boggling speed. The epicenters of this back to the city movement are the epicenters of the new urban crisis. The bigger the city, the denser the city, the more diverse city, and I might add, the more likely it is to vote for progressive politicians, and in the United States I would say Democrat and left-leaning Democrats, the more in our U.S. parlance bluer that city is, The higher the rate of inequality, the higher the rate of economic segmentation, the higher the rate of housing unaffordability, the higher the rate of gentrification. It almost sounds paradoxical. A crisis, a new urban crisis, not of the failure of our cities, but of their success. Where the best and most knowledge-driven, the most creative, the most diverse cities have the highest levels of inequality, the highest levels of social division. And here's what I think is so interesting for us, and here's why I was so honored when Maria and her team asked me to come to speak with you. If the biggest and most powerful cities in the global economy, New York, London, San Francisco, the epicenter of high tech, we can go on. If Los Angeles, the center of film and movie making. You know, another remarkable comeback story. One economist said, the city that would contradict my thesis more than anywhere else was Berlin. Because he was sure that Berlin, with its bohemian vibe, how he used all kinds of disparaging words, its lack of a work ethic, they people don't want to work, they're bohemian Berlin, it's got a laid-back feel, it's poor but sexy. The second largest cluster of high-tech companies in Europe, next to London, Berlin. So why I was honored to come here and to talk to Maria, Deputy Mayor, was because I think what we might think of as second-tier global cities, like Toronto and like Vienna. When you look at these lists of global cities and you see the New Yorks and the Londons and the Shanghais and the Beijings and the Paris and the this and the that, Vienna typically comes in the top 20 or 25, and Toronto's about 15th. Actually, when we ran our data and looked at quality of life, you always rank high in the quality of life, just like Toronto. You know, it's like Vienna, Vancouver, Toronto, Melbourne, Sydney, always way up there in the quality. When you look at the quality of life in Canada, Toronto goes up the list, Vienna becomes 9th. 9th in our indices, taking all these measures, the 9th leading global city. What my thinking was that maybe there's something we share in a place like Vienna and a place like Toronto, that we can begin to adapt and learn from the extreme and extremely exacerbated new urban crisis of the New Yorks, the Los Angeles, the San Franciscos, and London, and begin to implement strategies to combat this. This will not be easy. This new urban crisis is propelled by incredibly strong forces. It's not just market forces. It's the fact that in order to generate creative outcomes, in order to generate innovation, in order to be productive, we jam ourselves together. You've been lucky. In Toronto, we've been lucky. In Toronto, we have a commitment to diversity. We're the most multicultural city in the world. Our transit system isn't perfect, but we invested in one. We've invested in public health, in contrast to the United States. We don't have the legacy of slavery. We have racism, but not the legacy of racism in the United States. And of course, in Toronto, there may be gun ownership, but not everybody on the street has a gun. In Vienna, you have a legacy of social democracy. You have a green movement. You have a progressive tradition. You have history. You may not be quite as diverse as we are, quite as multicultural, but you're a multicultural community. You have a strong social infrastructure. I remember when we were doing research at City Lab at the Atlantic, talking about places that have had solutions to housing unaffordability. These were market-based economists. These were the kind of almost libertarian economies that pointed to Vienna and said, one of the cities that has been so interesting is you here in Vienna because you have a long history of public government ownership, socially subsidized housing, which has not created the problem of housing. Yeah, it's expensive here. But not the extreme housing unaffordability that ravages cities like London. So I thought that there were some things we could learn together. Look, I've had the great good fortune of living a long time. I had the great good fortune of working in a field. I'll tell you, nobody was interested in it. Not just my parents thought it was a dumb move. When I told people back in the 1970s and 80s I wanted to be an urbanist, the best they could do was laugh. They couldn't even understand what I wanted to do. I've seen my field become probably the greatest and most interesting field in the world. And I've seen cities come back in a way no one, certainly no one who grew up in Newark in 1960s, 1970s, certainly no one who was in New York City when it announced bankruptcy in 1975, I've seen cities come back in a way that no one in the year 2000 would have ever predicted. If someone would have stood on this stage and said that Pittsburgh and Detroit would come back, people would have thought they were patently insane. We have big challenges ahead of us. Big challenges. Our great cities have seen so much clustering that it's gone from being a good thing to a problematic thing. They've seen so many people want to come in that the land values have risen astronomically and less advantaged folks have been priced out. These divides between cities, between the successful cities like Vienna and Toronto, London and New York, San Francisco and the rest. You want to know where populism comes from? That's where it comes from. It comes from the fact that talented and creative people have made their way to urban areas. Those places have changed their values. They become more modern. Different than my mom and dad. Different than folks from the south of Italy, or from rural parts of Austria, or from rural parts of the United States or Canada, who feel that these shifts in our society, I would say wrongly, but their view, shifts in our society that give gay and lesbian people rights, that give women reproductive rights, that prize the environment, are not a cost or something they want to pay. They want to go back to the traditional way of life, right? They want to go back to the old way of life that if you were a man, you were on top. If you're a white man, you did good. And all these new challenges of women and gay rights would go away. But the problem is they won't. They can't. The society we live in is premised on creative energy. This isn't a choice. That's what I want to say. Here's the little small n Marxist in me. This isn't a choice. This is a fact of the economic motor of the mode of production. Creativity and knowledge and innovation and human talent are the very stuff of our economic engine. So then the challenge is, how do we fix this crisis of success? How do we create an innovative knowledge and creative society? How do we create a progressive agenda? That's the challenge ahead of us. It's hopefully what we'll get to talk about. How do we create a progressive agenda built from the local up? Built from the local up, that can enable us to nurture and harness the economic good, the economic engine, the economic productivity, but deal with the challenges and create not just a creative economy, but a creative society which nurtures and develops the creative talents of each and every single individual, and make sure that each and every single individual can live in the kind of neighborhood, in the kind of house, in the kind of community that they seek to live in. Thanks for your patience in listening to me, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Well, thanks for a fascinating lecture. As a matter of fact, I just want to tell you that I have read the book and it's not as boring as Richard claims. For the ones of you who have not done it, I would suggest you do so. It's really a highly interesting book. And listening to you, I have prepared some questions, but they kind of got more and more and more, and right now I'm trying to figure out where to start. I would like to start with the 3 T's. You didn't talk about them much tonight. The main idea is that cities should invest in the 3 T's, which is talent, technology, and tolerance, in order to attract the creative class. Now, looking at cities, and not only superstar cities, I get the feeling that the 3rd T got lost along the way.
So it's really interesting. I came here fully prepared to talk about the 3 T's. I'm not dialing my phone. I actually have the statistics for Austria on my phone. I keep them in a Google Drive. So I actually was going to read them to you, but then in the interest of time, something had to go and the 3 T's went. So when I was writing the book, the kind of interesting story that's not in the book is, remember the story about my mom just saying that whole thing was turgid and terrible and the thesis of throwing it away? When I was starting to write Rise of the Creative Class, I decided I would write the book for my mother. And my mother always said, because she thought I was a smart kid, She always said, Richard, you're a smart kid, your teachers like you, even in Catholic school, you're doing well. The 3 R's, remember the 3 R's. A silly English language expression, 3 R's. They're not, you'll see in a minute, they're not really 3 R's. They're reading, writing, and arithmetic. Only one of those, the first one is an R. So I figured, can I create a formula about cities that would appeal to my mother, the 3 T's? So the funny thing is, the 3 T's were originally technology, talent, and trade. So they really were. The original 3 T's were technology, talent, and trade. The idea being that cities that trade more and export would be more successful. The other 12 I'll tell you in a second. Technology, the cities that had technology would be more successful, cities that have more talent. And the idea coming from Pittsburgh was this, and this is how it changed. Pittsburgh was a leader in technology. It had surprisingly fantastic technology infrastructure, great universities ranked at the top. But the technology was exported. The second T was talent. And in order to grow your economy, you not only had to produce technology, you had to produce the really talented people that make the technology. But what I found is that Pittsburgh was doing that. I often used to say when I lived there, the great export for Pittsburgh wasn't steel, it was our talent. The third T is tolerance. It's not trade. It's the factors that enable people to want to stay. And actually, the statistics for Austria are okay. I mean, you rank 20th in the creative class, 26th on the talent index, not bad out of 200 countries. 12th on the technology index, on that on par with Sweden, Canada, and China, so not bad company, huh? 4th in R&D investment, which is one component of that. But where you lag is actually on tolerance, and that's where Pittsburgh lagged. You've been in Pittsburgh, comparatively speaking, but you rank 32nd of these 200 nations. And the idea being that if you were open-minded to diversity and had gay rights, and treated gay people fairly, and women's rights, and interracialism, and high rates of immigration, that created economic advantage. There's a 4th T, actually. I called it quality of place. Somebody then called it territory. And about last month, a young woman came up to me and said, you're talking about terroir. I'm like, why didn't I learn that 2 decades ago? The 4th T is really the kind of historic and all of the great things that is localized and interesting and not just about your place, and you have a lot of that. So the thing is, the combination of those 3 T's create economic advantage, but the one that we emphasized was that 3rd T, tolerance. And I'm not so sure it's fallen away from cities. Here's what I think has happened. I think that those of us in cities didn't realize how intolerant the rest of society really was. And that people like, fortunately, and I come here especially, my dad stormed the beaches at Normandy, so this is very personal to me. My dad fought in all the great battles of World War II, loved this country, by the way. To see Donald Trump there is not like the greatest day of my life, that's all I'll say, in mixed company. But there was a degree of intolerance in the world that we underestimated. And I think people like Trump have made that, I don't want to call it legitimate. I'm an English speaker, I can't even find the right word. They created the context for this intolerance to come spilling out. Now, I don't think it's a majority. I think it's a minority, but a very forceful minority. And this is a big change. This change from an old industrial economy to a knowledge economy is huge. It's bigger than the change Marx wrote about from the farm to an industrial society. So it's going to have earth-shaking effects for people who don't fit in, and I just think they're scared as heck. And the question is then, how do we build a vision of tolerance and open-mindedness and forwardness that can win the day against these forces of reaction? I mean, that's the question.
Well, indeed, it is the question. But looking at cities and the way they are developing right now, I always get the feeling that there's 2 competing models, right? One is what I personally call bubble city. Yep. So it's a city that has technology, but it has a high degree of segregation. It has gated communities. It has most of the times affordability issues. It is diverse, but then it is highly segregated. Yep. So once again, you have this kind of clusters, and you have different types of people organizing themselves in different parts of the city. So you may have tolerance there, but you will kind of get the kind of city where tolerant people will tend to live together in one neighborhood, and then you have other neighborhoods that are not tolerant. And most of the times you can see that these cities tend to be combined with what we all call illiberal democracy, right?
Yep.
And this tends to be a successful economical model as well. On the other hand, you may have cities not only with the 3 T's, but what we would call here in Vienna the 3 I's. So it's inclusiveness and innovation and identity in the sense of belonging together, right? And having a feeling of belonging. There are cities with high porosity in terms of social porosity, right? They're affordable, they have high quality public places and services, so we're talking actually about Vienna. But really, to be honest, please tell me that if you lose the 3rd T, then in the long term, you lose the creative class as well.
For sure. And I think there's a 2-stage battle that has to be fought. And maybe I'll go inside out. I think the first battle is to protect our cities, even as troubled as they are, from all the stuff outside them. You know, as an American, I see what Donald Trump is trying to do to really hurt cities. Pull funding, engage in real attacks. In Toronto, by the way, the crazy mayor, he's died. His brother is now the premier. He runs the state. In one day, he reduced the size of our city council from 43 people to 25. He has unilaterally, taken away Toronto's right to control its own development. He just gave over whole swatches of the cities to developers to build giant towers. He's trying to take over our transit system. I mean, so I would say the first order thing is that we have to protect cities against the forces that they call it preemption, or the forces of whatever outside. That's job one, and I think it's a big deal. I think cities are under more attack, and so empower cities, give cities more rights, devolve power, the kinds of things they were doing in the United Kingdom, all of that. The second thing is with regard to cities themselves and different types. I tend to think that most people who come to live in cities, most, not all, want to live in a city for exactly the reasons you said. They don't want to live in a gated community. They're willing to put up with less space and more density, more dirt, more grime, more noise, more hassle. To live in a city which is multicultural. To live in a city where their kids are exposed to different cultures. I think what's happening now in some of these cities that haven't had the appropriate public policy response is that only rich people can afford that. That it's a luxury that only rich people can afford because people who don't have that kind of money can't afford even a little apartment. And I think what you're saying is there are cities that, because of historical forces, because of their progressive governance, whatever the reason, and Vienna may define this, but I just want to give a plug for New York. New York, too, in contrast to many other U.S. cities, despite its problems, has a lot more public housing. You know, it's not on the order of Vienna by any means. But if you're a poor person in New York, you're probably a lot better off than being a poor person in many other places because you have social housing and a social safety net, and because every mayor, including the new mayor, has committed to building more. In Vienna, of course, you have a much deeper legacy, much greater legacy. But I think the question now is one of public policy. I think that's what you're getting to. It may be in our DNA to some cities to do more inclusion, have more of a focus on identity, on allowing people to thrive, more diversity. But I think it's going to be a public policy issue. We're going to have to develop strategies to promote that. And what's happening, and I think the threat to Vienna, when the market discovers you, like I said this when I moved to Toronto 12 years ago and everyone was laughing at me. I said the market's going to discover it for a long time. Like it's just waiting. It's so spectacular and so beautiful. Mercer, right? The Mercer rates at like Vienna. And of course, now housing prices in Toronto on a per square foot basis are getting close to housing prices in Manhattan. It took 12 years. But so I think when the market discovers all of the things that are great about a city, the market then begins to trample. So it needs a strong set of public policies and a strong set of principles to make a city an inclusive and affordable city.
Well, as a matter of fact, we are actually amidst the market having discovered us. And we're doing something about it, but we will return to this a little bit later. When I look, while reading the book, I came across two different ways that you're addressing clusters.
Yep.
There's a negative way in terms of social clusters and segregation throughout the city. But then later on, when describing the 7 pillars, what to do against the urban crisis, you actually state that clusters, and you talked about it actually before as well, are actually the way economy functions. Could you just talk a little bit about the difference, or just make it a little bit more precise?
So what I like about this conversation and what's happening here and us being able to talk and work together is, in urbanism, it's like a yin and a yang. There are a group of people who say clusters are great, we need to build them, they're going to create innovation and knowledge, and these are really smart economists who I admire, and then, as if by magic, all their benefits will trickle down. And they kind of have a point. On average, if you're in a cluster, you have a better job. On average, if you're in a cluster, it creates 5 other subsidiary jobs. The question is, if you're in a cluster, it drives up housing prices, and only really advantaged people can afford to be in the cluster. And then there are people, on the other hand, on the kind of urbanist left, critical left, who say, making a very reasonable point, it's gentrification, it's the neoliberal taking over of cities. In Florida, you're to blame for this because it's your creative class toolbook that gave them the tools to do this. And then they realize this. And I think the only way out of this is it has to be both. You're going to have to build successful economies, and the only way to do that is through clustering of innovation and talent and knowledge. But on the other hand, we're going to have to create progressive public policies that enable people to benefit from that clustering phenomenon, just not a winner-take-all. Look, by way of historical analogy, look around Vienna. There are a lot, unless I'm the crazy one, there's a lot of palaces here. Am I right? All out in the city, throughout the city, where a lot of really rich people lived, and they had like guards. And the people who lived outside those palaces, my guess is, didn't do that great. I don't know, I'm not a historian of Vienna. But in many cities, the people outside were in worse than starvation. This is what Marx wrote about. And then we had an industrial revolution, and the capitalist class did fantastically well. And the workers did, the shits. I mean, working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, worked to death. And then labor parties, social democratic parties, we can go down the list, came up and said, no. This winner-take-all thing has to be spread. Workers need rights. They need the ability to join a union. We need a social safety net. We need the underpinnings of social democracy. And then all of a sudden we woke up by magic and said, oh, we have a middle class. We made that middle class. You think the same analogy today is, actually, you can create a set of public policies that upgrade service work, government subsidies for affordable housing. I talk about it in the book. You can make this clustered creative economy also better for more people, but we need the political will and the progressive political coalitions to do that, and I think that's the hard part. Up until now, it's been hard to build that well.
Well, I think we love to hear this in Vienna, that it's almost all about affordable housing. What you also address in the book is the issue of land prices rising as well, which is actually something that we have been facing in Vienna as well. There's 2 things I would like you to talk a little bit about. First of all, you describe some ideas about how to get about rising prices. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this, and then I will tell you what Vienna has done. And I would like to hear your opinion on this.
It's interesting to me, as somebody who studied Marx, there's another 19th century figure who's not studied very much. And in fact, if you look at economic textbooks, the classical factors of production were land, labor, and capital. But land was taken out. Like, nobody cares about land anymore. And it's really interesting to me that land has come back with a vengeance. And anyway, this other 19th century theorist was a guy named Henry George. I've spent a lot of time reading his work. I'm going to write something about it, not a small thing. Basically, Henry George was an American analog of Marx. And what he argued, Marx said, the big struggle in the economy was between the capitalists who own the means of production and the workers. And the capitalists basically steal from the workers, take the surplus value. George said something else. he said the people who end up with all the surplus are the landlords. They take the surplus from the workers and the capitalists. Now, I'm not saying he was completely right, but it's exactly what's happening. In San Francisco, in New York, in London, in Berlin, even the capitalists who've made the money, the venture capitalists, the entrepreneurs, they're buying the land. You see, they're putting that, they're becoming developers. Jeff Bezos just bought another $80 million worth of property in New York City yesterday. They're the people, they're moving the San Francisco Warriors, Steve Ballmer from Microsoft, moving them from Oakland into downtown San Francisco. A lot of these venture capitalists and tech industrialists and entrepreneurs are becoming the new landlords. So in a way, because land is, because of the clustering of human beings, not because land is valuable, most land is unoccupied, but in Vienna, in San Francisco, in New York, in London, in Berlin, where we cluster, it becomes valuable. So yeah, we have to deal with this. I think there's a couple of ways to do it. Most economists say build more. We can talk about that, and I think they're right, that if you build more, and if you create more, it'll make it more affordable. But some people argue that if you just build more and do nothing else, what you'll do is basically do a substitution. If you build high-rise condo towers without doing anything else and changing anything else, just more rich people will come in and more poor people will leave. That's a big debate. It goes on in our field. But what I think, you have to build more targeted affordable. You have to build affordable housing. You know, and this is, in some cases, you have to use blunt instruments like rent control. Many economists would argue with me and say rent control is very inefficient, but in some cases, you're going to have to use blunt instruments, even if it's just in the short run. You have to do transit. You have to invest in transit, which opens up development and development along transit lines, so you have more affordable housing. And yeah, you're going to have to do some kind of public subsidy. The only way you're going to make, and here's how you can do the public subsidy. You can do it by government construction, which may not be the most efficient way. You can do it by government, not government waivers, government grants to an individual, government transfers. You can do it by requiring developers to build it. This is what they're doing in New York. The former, your colleague, the former deputy mayor, and just left the Village of Glen, a great friend. Every new thing that's built a tower in New York, 20 to 30% affordable housing for low-income people. Have to be built, and you can't pay your way out, you gotta build it. Or, if you're Hong Kong, or you own a lot of municipal land, you can reduce the price of the land. You know what I'm saying? So that the private sector can build affordable housing on it. There's a number of ways to do it, but in some way, you've got to make it a public policy principle to use government power, if you will, political power, government power, to make sure that people have housing. And by the way, I agree. You know, sometimes people call me a neoliberal, a funny word. By the way, I agree that housing is a basic human right. I want to say that clearly. I think the right to a good job and good pay is a basic human right, and I've written about this. I think housing is a basic human right. It's something that goes along with free speech and liberty and all this stuff. So I think housing is a basic human right, and that's the way they have to confront it.
You also pledged for land value capture, right?
Henry George.
Anyway, what we're doing, as a matter of fact, in Vienna, ever since we got discovered by the market and land prices started becoming a huge problem, is that we have amended our code, and this means that now there's a new category, new zoning category, which is called social housing.
Yep.
So everything that is built that has more than 150 units has to be 2/3 social housing, or affordable housing, or at least, in exceptional cases, at least 50%.
Yep.
And this is actually also quite a bold measure, I would say. Yet hoping to see how it's going to work out. What would you say about this?
I think we have to. I mean, it's a version of what we call inclusionary zoning in the United States. And of course, New York has been the pioneer of this. Many other cities don't do it at all. But no, I think if not, you end up... Look, I don't think a city will ever become a... Some people say on the left, you're going to have a gated suburb. I don't think New York or San Francisco look like a gated suburb. They look like cities to me. There is a diversity of people who work in them. Like, if you go to an all-white gated suburb in New Jersey or Connecticut and Lower Manhattan, they are really different places. Permit me that. But they will have characteristics that look like that. They will have a much more economically homogeneous population. You need a much higher income not to work there, but to live there. So yeah, I think you now in the book I say, we have not quite yet drummed the creative and innovative energy out of any city yet, but if these tendencies towards homogeneity, of the blanding out of diversity, of a city becoming more homogeneous by socioeconomic class, then we risk, you know, Jane Jacobs said to me, the great Jane Jacobs said to me, you know, Richard, when a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. And that's what could happen, you know, in parts of London, parts of Paris, parts of New York, that has happened. Not in the whole city, by any means, but in parts of those cities, in certain neighborhoods, that has happened. So yeah, I think it is an obligation. What gives me great hope, by the way? How can I be optimistic? Has he completely lost his mind? You know, Donald Trump really is the president. He was standing where where my father. These economic transformations are hugely painful times. You've lived it here. You've seen it more in Vienna than we have in the States. They come with civil wars and class conflicts and world wars, and they're horrendous. In many ways, I don't want to go too far here. Jane Jacobs' last book was called Dark Age Ahead. So she was already on this. In many ways, we are doing a better job of managing this transformation than we give ourselves credit. I don't want to go too far, but there isn't a world war. We're not on each other's throat. There is a populist backlash, but if you look at the demographic data, it shows that young people don't share these beliefs with the old people, and the old people are going to die off. Okay, so they are. So what's going to happen? We're going to move to a better future. And you know where that better future is going to come from? It's going to come from cities. It's going to come from cities debating this stuff. And from political pressure to elect more progressive people. And if political leaders won't address these concerns, they'll be thrown out of office. And new leaders, so I think over time, we're moving in a positive direction. What I fear, I say this in the book, you have to bear with me. I say we've been stuck in urbanism between urban optimists, some people would have called me this, and urban pessimists. My friends on the urban critical left, who say all cities are gentrified, they're horrible, they're going to hell in a handbasket, they're neoliberal, they're market-based. And what I kind of say in the book is, we all need to work together to make our cities better, and better for people, and to rebuild the middle class, and provide affordable housing and better jobs. That we can't just stand on the sidelines and lob hand grenades. That's not sufficient. And the only way to do that is to build progressive political movements. And I think the hard part from my colleagues on the left, is that we live in a market-based society. Now, I thought long and hard about this as somebody who studied Marx. It's hard for me to think, maybe we can, of how we break with that market-based society. And every experiment I can think of that was a real hard break with it didn't go so well. So I just go back on the tradition of social democracy, particularly in Germany and this part of the world, Karl Kautsky particularly, who said reform, not revolution. That there's a way to work in the context of the market society, as much as we might not like its extreme outcomes and winner-take-all character, there's a way to work in the context and to create social and social whatever we want to call those reforms. Progressive reforms which make it better for more people. And that's what I think we have to do in cities. And I think we've lost that. We've either become pro-innovation or pro-housing construction or anti-everything, making these very strong statements. And really the task is to do the hard work of making our cities work and work for everybody. That's the hard part.
Now, I'll take another 3 questions of mine. And if we try to keep it short, then those poor guys will have a chance to, we could take 2 questions as well. Because I think we should call it a night at 9. Okay. Which is actually about half an hour later than I originally thought. Anyway, I agree with you. I'm also an urban optimist. And I agree that on the long run, cities are actually not the problem, they are the solution. But in the meantime, there's also a phenomenon that Ananya Roy was talking about last year in a lecture that I was able to follow. And she talked about this investor-driven thing of inviting creatives to settle down in a neighborhood that they plan to later on take over and do luxury housing. And she even talked about this case in Los Angeles a couple of years ago, where the Latin community actually chased away gallerists because they did not want this part of town to be gentrified in this way. And they realized that actually all these galleries settling down there were, yes, well, they did not come up with the idea to settle down there all by themselves. They were invited, so that you understand what I'm talking about. And she actually goes so far as she talks about expropriation and even extinction, because she says, in the end, it's not only about having to travel for 2 to 3 hours so that you can reach your working place. In the end, it's also about death, meaning riots, meaning police brutality, meaning all kinds of phenomena that go along with this. What are your thoughts about this? And also in terms of how do we go about this?
Well, developers are smart. And how developers make their money is they buy land at a low cost. And they do whatever they take to sell it at a much higher cost. And if they see artists or coffee shops or artisanal things as doing that, yeah. And there are many documented cases. And some of these cases are decent people, and some of them are horribly nefarious people. There was a guy in Miami named Tony Goldman who actually did a lot of good things in taking very low income, now these were industrial neighborhoods, there was no displacement of people, and turning that into artist housing with the belief that he could generate a little bit more economic activity and raise the prices. But there are others, developers, who, have seized upon this. We have to be careful. And the sad thing, when people say artists are the shock troops of gentrification, that begins to break my heart. I've studied artists a lot. Artists are people who really invest in their neighborhoods. I mean, more than techies or whatever. Artists and musicians are people who care so deeply about where they live, or the people who will go into high-risk neighborhoods and actually work to stabilize those neighborhoods. So I think the thing is to give people equity. Artists, creatives, and the locals. And one mechanisms we can think about are like community land trusts, or ways for human beings to create equity. What happens is even the lower income people who can afford to buy a house or have an art studio, when the neighborhood prices rise, they do okay. It's the people who don't have any ownership. So maybe there's some kind of community trust or some way we allow others. But what I worry about is that when people who I like make blanket statements like, oh my God, we should ban artists, and then what happens, is you get the Spike Lee phenomenon. And I write about Spike Lee, somebody who I admire, saying, all these people are coming in and taking over our neighborhoods and colonizing our neighborhoods, and it's pitting, in a way, worker, an ethnic group or racial group against the other one. So I think there's a better way out, and maybe it means, if we're in capitalism, either we're going to have to make housing more of a utility. I mean, at the end of the day, either housing becomes a utility and it's much more publicly owned, right? Or you tax it like crazy, which you said the land value tax. If the people don't develop it, you just tax them at 100%, or as close to 100% as you can. Or you enable many more people to own. Now, I don't know which one of those is right, but I know the current system we have, and where just a few people own and are owning more and more land, it's a very bad outcome.
Now, give me 3 minutes on that. Vienna ranks 9th on the Superstar Cities Index, right? But still, it's a second-tier city. Which challenges do cities like Vienna face, with regard to what is the biggest challenge?
So I actually think we face the biggest challenges, and I'm going to lump Vienna and Toronto together. Crude thing, but let's do it because you're from Vienna, I'm from Toronto. I think that places like New York and London know how to deal with big crises and bad political fights. And they know, like, New York is just confident. It sounds so weird, but if we had Alicia here, she's like, for sure we're going to fix this. Like, there's no doubt in my mind. Yeah, it's going to be a pain, and the developers stink, and the techies are a problem, and Amazon was like a bitch, she'd say, but we'll fix it. It's New York. We'll fix it. We'll get social housing. We'll get affordable housing. We'll do it. And transit's a nightmare, but we'll fix it. I bet Sadiq Khan would have something similar to say. I think what happens in the second group of cities is that we've been striving so much in many ways, like it or not, to join the first group, or comparing ourselves to the first group, that the changes we have to make are so drastic that we go, I don't want to speak for Vienna, but here's what happens in Toronto. Toronto's now a city that's quite big. It's getting to be 6 million people in the metropolitan area. You can't drive your car around. The roads are congested worse than Manhattan. Housing has become $1,000, $1,200 a square foot, almost comparable if you take the currency at parity, which it's not, comparable to Manhattan. I mean, it's got levels of inequity, but then what people are saying is not, they'll go back. No, ban the bike lanes. You know, we don't want transit, we want cars to go faster. We don't want more condominiums or social housing, we want to develop more in the green belt. So I think what happens sometimes in the smaller cities is this change that we have to make is so big that we're scared of it and we begin to yank backwards. Now, I don't want to speak for Vienna, but I certainly saw it in Toronto, where we elected two very, I would have never thought we would elect two very conservative populist politicians. One is mayor, one is premier, but we have in a very progressive city because of the fear of becoming a global city. And that's what worries me the most in the second cities, is that we will, instead of looking forward, you know, and you're in part of the world where there has been horrible nativist movements. I mean, you've avoided a lot of it here, but all around you, right, has been this horrible populist, nationalistic thing. So that's what worries me a lot, that in our second, that these cities that I love so much, a backlash will ensue. Now, hopefully we get over it, but that's what worries me. That's what keeps me up at night.
It's quite a pity I asked this in the end. I should have asked it in the beginning, because I would have loved to get deeper into it. But we've actually run out of time. So my last question, my personal last question, and then we have time for two. Now, you are suspected to be a neoliberal. And I think I've never heard the word Marx so often as tonight. You make a pledge, for instance, for raising minimum wages drastically, and other pledges we've all heard tonight. So, what are you?
Yeah, frustrated.
I mean, we all need labels, right?
No, I think, you know, I mean, to be honest, you know, when I decided to write Rise of the Creative Class, I could have written it in impenetrable Marxist jargon. My mother already threw that manuscript on the front step. I wrote a book that could communicate to mayors, deputy mayors, city leaders, urban leaders, who were not quite as steeped in urban critical theory. And I wrote a book in just plain language. And one other thing, I made a very Kautsky-an assumption that I could not invoke truly utopian socialism, that I was stuck in a market economy and would write in the logic of trying to make the market economy work better. So I think when you do that, people go, oh my God, he's an apologist for the market, and he's not using the jargon word, so he's a neoliberal. And that's okay, because I don't think we're going to invoke, you know, I'm old. I just don't think we're going to lurch to the left. If anything, you know what, I'm scared. I look across the arc of my life, and I see two things happening. I may be insane. I see the worst of times at the national level, at best. I see a constant, chronic rightward march at the national level. There have been interruptions. There have been some good times. But if I look across the march of Europe and the United States, from the day I was born in 1957 down, I see this, that, to the right. And I see our cities getting constantly better. Best of times in cities, worst of times at the national level. So I'm not sure we're going to invoke national level utopian socialism. In fact, I think the battle we're going to fight is much harder. It's going to be to fight off reactionary, nativistic populism at an ugly scale that we haven't seen since the time my dad ended up in the shores of Normandy. So I might become much more incrementalist. So I would say I'm like a Kautskyite. I'm a Kautskyist social democrat. Sorry, apologies to you for that. A Kautskyist social democrat for a knowledge economy, trying to make the case that we can make the knowledge economy in cities work better for many more people. I would add one thing. That's why I was so honored. We didn't get a chance to talk about it. Maybe we can talk about it later. We can talk about it later. The one thing I'm not an expert in is the environment. You were kind enough not to ask me. But I do think the synthesis of green, the green, you say red-green here, a very interesting set of words for us in the United States and Canada. The synthesis of a green agenda, the climate change, sea level rise, the environmental catastrophe, with a more progressive political agenda around cities, which is market-based, but let's say social democratic. Boy, and I think highly local, not national. Yeah, I think that's what I am. That's what I am. And reform with, maybe what Kowski said, reform without revolution. Not because I don't believe in revolution, I just think the easier and better and more productive path in the long run is reforming the system to be the best it possibly can be. But, you know, I can be a foil for argument. That's a good thing to be, you know, and then you provoke other arguments, and look, we're all in this together. We make a society better together, not for any individual. So as long as I can provoke smart arguments and smart people to think both for and against me, maybe I've done a decent job.
Well, thanks for clarifying. And I don't mind you being a social democrat. I'm surrounded by them. So,
that's the best thing I've ever heard.
Okay, Marco. As a matter of fact, I'm not discriminating. I know him, but he put up his hand first, really. Yeah. And please, you know, just a question. Yes.
Just a question, yeah. I'm Marco, I'm from the Green Party. I represent 10,000 entrepreneurs here in Vienna who are in the creative industry. Advertisement companies, graphic designers, etc. We just did a research on graphic designers, it is the question, and we just found out data.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, just hold it like this, okay, because we cannot hear well.
Okay, sorry. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And we just did the research, and we found out that graphic designers, so we asked them, how much money do you get? And we had the data from 10 years ago, and we just found out that the income of graphic designers, which are part of the creative class, dropped 40% in 10 years. Yep. I was just curious if you have amounts of other cities and if this is happening everywhere.
Well, I mean, you know, precarious employment. Welcome to the unstable world of knowledge-based capitalism. And many of the things people applauded about this new age of flexibility, we're now learning that we need ways to support workers that are more traditional. We need, maybe it's not traditional unions in the way my father's industrial union worked, but it's new ways of creating collective support for workers and knowledge workers. And that's a big challenge. What are the most effective ways of providing collective support and mechanisms for organizing knowledge workers? It was different when you jammed a bunch of people in a giant factory, and they all lived around the factory and went to the same 3 churches. They're pretty easy to organize, actually. Organizing knowledge workers is a lot harder, you know? And especially when they're working from a desktop computer, wherever, in a coffee shop. So maybe it's new modes of organization, but you mentioned it. Higher minimum wage, for sure higher minimum wage. Secondly, some kind of universal basic income at a reasonable level. We tried it in Canada, these idiot conservatives beat it back. And then I think the other thing, it's not for graphic designers, but I think upgrading the service. Now, look, in Vienna and Europe, you're in much better shape on this. You guys can hear me, right? I talked about that. So I think it means helping the service workers, particularly. I don't mean to deflate the point of graphic design, 100% right, but it's really increasing the wages and improving the working conditions of people who work in food service, food preparation, which if the creative class is 35 or 36%, it's 50% of the workforce. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff on the wage and employment and labor and work side. And in fact, in Europe, you just have many better advantages. But this is the key moving forward.
Now one last question. You, sir.
Yeah, you're good.
And hold it like this.
No. It's on. He's probably got to get it on the board.
Okay, I'm trying to speak very loud.
Yeah, I'm with you.
All right.
I think creativity is a driver for change, and resilient cities are very good for that. But you didn't talk about the relationship between cities and the countryside. And I can see here the big challenge we have in our cities, that we are driven by people outside. And if we look here at Vienna in Austria, or if we look at Berlin or any big cities where they want to go, we are somehow have to get the countryside on board. And I don't know what you see the future, that this challenge that we divide our society more and more between the cities and the countryside. And I'm wondering really how we can create a bridge for the future, because we cannot solve this problem.
So this is something I spend a huge amount of my time thinking about. And I would argue to you that this division, I said, there's two kinds of inequality. Most people talk about economic inequality, the difference in wages and incomes between capitalists and different kinds of workers, or geographic, and what I would say is geographic or spatial inequality. The difference between successful cities and urban areas and outlying suburbs and rural areas, or between winter cities, like Vienna, or Berlin, or Toronto, and the rest of their, or London. Look at Brexit. Look at Trump. You know, Mrs. Clinton won every big city and every thriving place by incredible margins. And the more technologically innovative, the more creative, she won them by whopping margins. Trump just took the rest of the country. So, look, here's what I think the battle we're against. And this is where sometimes I have very big arguments, pointed arguments with my colleagues on the critical left. This is the fight. And what's happening, I can tell you, because I'm living it every day, is that some of these agents of reaction, they want to kill the cities. I'm not making this up. I mean, Trump is trying to do it. Trump's trying to kill the cities. In Toronto, the new premier is trying to destroy Toronto. This is his objective. Now, I'm a kinder, gentler person than this, and I agree with you. Even if they're out to kill me, I don't think I can win by trying to kill them. I think there's only one way around this, is that we empower each to live the way they want to live. Now, you might say Florida's completely lost its marbles, but I don't think there's any way I can convince somebody in rural Ontario or rural Connecticut that they should come downtown Manhattan and live in a condo around gay people and women-empowered rights in a green environment, taking transit, and give up their guns. What I think my only strategy is to say, let me live the way I want to live, you live the way you want to live, and okay, we'll have some national organizations that say you can't shoot me, and luckily you don't have these problems here. But I think we are so different that we need some mechanism of accommodating people, and I call it a new federalism, a new localism, where we can live and respect. I think what's happened, and why it gets blown up nationally, is we have this battle. If I run the national government, it's my way. If you run the national government, it's your way, and we're both so scared. So I think it's a bridge, but it's an accommodation. That's what I think is the biggest challenge. How do we build systems which are resilient in the fact that they recognize the differences, the very real difference between, and here's the statistic I would give you. Roughly 30% of the population in North America lives in cities and urban areas. I forget what it is. It's not quite, yeah, it's probably 60 or 65% live in suburbs, and the rest live in rural areas. Most people who live in urban areas like urban areas and are happy that they live there. Most people who live in suburbs like their suburbs and are happy that they live there. Most people, so we vote with our feet in a way. And so I think building political and policy systems that reflect that differentiation is okay. As long as we keep national systems that protect, basically give basic protections to people by gender, by race, by ethnicity, to their basic rights. I think that's the only way out. And then over time, the data that comes from polling and surveys of younger people say that these divides will, over time, become much less pointed. So, but that would be my suggestion.
Well, thanks a lot, Richard.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time. Thank you, everybody. You've been a wonderful audience. As a matter of fact, I would like to invite you to stay on a little bit. If you leave this direction, you will enter the next room, and there are drinks there. So you can stay on a while and chat to each other, perhaps get a chance to talk a little bit with Richard. Now, on my behalf, I would like to remind you that this is the second evening in a series of such evenings that we are planning on behalf of the city of Vienna. We started with the two Richards, Richard Sennett and myself. And in the autumn, yes, and it's been also quite a difference, you know, between the two of you.
But we like each other.
I like him too.
Yeah, we like each other.
But we will be returning with the series in the autumn. So, to put it in an American way, stay tuned and enjoy the drinks. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.